I'm Captain Eva Rostova of the United States Air Force. I'm 34. And for the last 10 years, my family has treated my career as a youthful rebellion they were patiently waiting for me to outgrow. Tonight, at Thanksgiving dinner, after my first visit home in 3 years, my father just raised a toast to his successful children, looked me dead in the eye, and publicly called me a failure in front of our entire extended family. He has no idea about the promotion I received last month or the real nature of my work. He also has no idea that my commanding officer and a tactical team are currently on standby, just 2 miles from this house, awaiting a single text from me for an emergency extraction. He thinks he's finally putting his disappointing daughter in her place. He's about to find out exactly what my place is. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, let me know where you're watching from, hit that like button, and stick around. Because my family is about to get a lesson in command and control they will never forget. I was the child my father never knew how to brag about. In the manicured suburbs of Northern Virginia, where status is the local currency, my father, David Rostova, a senior partner at a powerful DC law firm, had a clear vision for his children's success. It was a triptych of traditional achievement he could proudly display at cocktail parties and country club gatherings. My older sister, Anya, fulfilled the first part of his vision with breathtaking precision. She attended Georgetown Law, just like him, and was now a rising star in the Justice Department, her name occasionally appearing in the footnotes of politically significant cases. My younger brother, Mark, completed the second panel, graduating from Johns Hopkins Medical School and securing a coveted residency in surgery at a prestigious Baltimore hospital. They were clear, linear paths he could recount with pride, their successes reflecting his own. Anya, the sharp legal mind. Mark, the brilliant surgeon. And me, I chose the military. I enlisted in the Air Force right after high school, a decision so far outside his realm of understanding that he could only process it as a personal affront, a rebellious phase he seemed to be waiting for me to outgrow. He never understood that my choice wasn't a rejection of him, but an embrace of something he couldn't offer. A world built on merit, not connections, on demonstrated competence, not perceived status. I craved the structure, the purpose, the undeniable reality of a world where your rank was earned through qualification and performance, not inherited or bestowed. While my father saw a dead-end career of peeling potatoes and following orders, I saw a path to becoming a pilot, to commanding technology that pushed the boundaries of human achievement. I saw a way to be measured by what I could do, not who I was born to. The family's reaction to my enlistment was a study in polite condescension. My father sighed and said, "Well, at least it will teach you discipline." My mother, a woman whose own ambitions had long been subsumed by my father's, wrung her hands and worried about my safety, which was her way of expressing disapproval without inviting conflict. Anya gave me a pitying look and suggested I could always apply to law school later, once you get this out of your system. Mark was the only one who showed a flicker of genuine interest, asking about the technical specs of the aircraft I hoped to fly. But even his curiosity was framed by the family's core belief that this was a temporary detour from a more respectable life. Despite his disapproval, I was a devoted daughter. I wrote home weekly from basic training. I called on every holiday, listening patiently as they recounted the latest triumphs of my siblings. And when I began to earn a steady salary, I saw it as my duty to contribute. My mother's multiple sclerosis had progressed over the years, and while my father's income was substantial, his spending habits were equally so. The mounting medical expenses for her treatments and in-home care were a constant source of tension. So, for my first deployment, I sent a significant portion of my salary home, an automatic transfer that landed in their account every month without fail. I never mentioned it, and they never acknowledged it, but I knew it eased their burden. I knew it paid for the specialized physical therapy and the experimental medications not fully covered by their insurance. I paid for the family vacations I could never attend, wiring extra funds before their annual trip to the Caribbean so they could upgrade to a beachfront villa. I watched on social media as they posted photos of themselves, smiling and tanned, never mentioning the daughter in a desert climate whose contribution made the trip possible. When Mark finished his residency, bogged down by student loans, he called me, not our father, to ask for help with the down payment on a new car. Dad would just give me a lecture about fiscal responsibility, he'd said. You've always been the practical one. I covered the loan without hesitation, knowing he'd likely never pay me back. I did these things because I believed that's what family did. You showed up, you supported, you gave, even when it wasn't acknowledged, even when it wasn't reciprocated. My vision of family was a system of mutual support. Theirs, I was slowly beginning to understand, was a hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, I was a utility, a resource to be drawn upon but never celebrated. My financial contributions were accepted not as generosity, but as my proper role, a quiet atonement for the disappointment of my career choice. For years, I told myself this was a fair trade. I couldn't give them the bragging rights of a lawyer or a doctor, so I would give them my quiet, steady financial support. I thought that by being the responsible one, the one who solved problems without asking for praise, I might eventually earn a different kind of respect. I was wrong. I was simply teaching them that my contributions required no acknowledgement, that my boundaries were infinitely flexible, and that my role in the family was to give, while theirs was to take. It was a lesson they learned all too well. On the rare occasions I made it home, I felt like a stranger in my own childhood house. Leave was infrequent and short, and trying to slot myself back into the family dynamic felt like trying to solve a puzzle with a missing piece. The conversational rhythm of the Rostova household was a well-oiled machine, fueled by my siblings' professional achievements. Over dinner, Anya would hold court with stories of courtroom victories, dissecting her cross-examination of a hostile witness with the same clinical precision our father used to discuss his legal cases. She'd talk about navigating the complex political landscape of the Justice Department, about memos she drafted that were now influencing policy, and about the promising future her superiors saw for her. Dad would listen with rapt attention, interjecting with sharp questions and proud affirmations. "That's my girl," he'd say, thinking 3 steps ahead. "That's the Rostova way." Mark, in turn, would share tales from the operating room, describing a complex surgical triumph, a life saved through a risky but brilliant procedure. He spoke of the respect he was earning from senior surgeons, the gratitude of patients' families, and the demanding but exhilarating life of a surgical resident. My mother would hang on his every word, her face a mixture of pride and vicarious anxiety. It was a closed loop of mutual admiration, a performance of success in which I had no speaking part. When I tried to share a story about my work, the atmosphere would shift subtly but immediately. The energy would drain from the room. I once tried to describe the intricate process of coordinating a multinational logistics operation, a complex dance of moving personnel and equipment across continents under immense pressure. I was proud of the work, of the seamless execution my team had achieved. Halfway through my explanation of flight paths and cargo manifests, I saw my father's eyes glaze over. He offered a tight, polite smile and turned to my mother. "Eliner, did you remember to call the caterer for the fundraiser?" And just like that, the conversation was over. My world, with its life-and-death logistics and global responsibilities, was reduced to a boring anecdote, less interesting than party planning. Another time, I tried to explain the technology behind the new reconnaissance drones I was being trained on, the sophisticated optics and data analysis capabilities. My father cut me off before I could even get to the interesting part. "Let's not bore everyone, honey," he'd said with a wave of his hand, as if protecting the family from my tedious, irrelevant world. He then turned to Anya and asked about a Supreme Court case, and the conversational current immediately flowed back into familiar, respectable channels. The most painful slights often came disguised as jokes. During one Christmas dinner, surrounded by extended family, my uncle asked me what I actually did in the Air Force. Before I could answer, Mark chimed in with a laugh. "Oh, Dad's so proud of her. He tells everyone his daughter serves her country, but he leaves out the part where she's probably just peeling potatoes." The table erupted in laughter. My aunts and cousins, my own mother, even my father, all chuckling at the image of me in a mess hall, a low-skilled laborer in their grand narrative of family success. Mark probably thought it was a harmless jab, a bit of sibling ribbing. But it was a small, sharp cut that revealed the truth of their perception. It wasn't just that they didn't understand my work. It was that they had actively replaced the complex reality with a simplistic, dismissive caricature. They couldn't imagine me in a position of authority or technical expertise, so they pictured me peeling potatoes. It was easier for them to process. That joke was a warning. It solidified the fact that my career wasn't just a disappointment to my father. It was an embarrassment, a narrative inconvenience that had to be either ignored or belittled to fit into the polished story of the Rostova family. I started to notice other, smaller signs of my otherness. When family friends visited, my father would introduce Anya as our brilliant lawyer and Mark as our gifted surgeon. He would introduce me as our Eva, who's in the service. The description was always vague, generic, as if the details were too unseemly to mention in polite company. My bedroom at home, once a sanctuary, had slowly been transformed into a storage space. My old bookshelves were now filled with my mother's gardening supplies. My desk used to store my father's old law journals. They kept a bed in there, but the message was clear. This was no longer my space. I was a visitor, a guest whose connection to this home was temporary and conditional. The financial support I provided was never, ever mentioned. It was the silent, unacknowledged river flowing beneath the surface of our family life. They would talk about the rising cost of my mother's care, and in the next breath, discuss booking a non-refundable European cruise. They never made the connection, or if they did, they never acknowledged that my disappointing career was funding their comfortable lifestyle. My money was acceptable, respectable even. But the work that earned it was not. I was a walking contradiction, and it was a contradiction they resolved by simply ignoring half of my existence, the half that didn't fit their narrative. It was Thanksgiving, my first one home in 3 years. My last 2 leaves had been consumed by mandatory training and a short-notice deployment. This time, I had fought for the time off, navigated a logistical nightmare of flight schedules and duty rosters, all for this. A few days of feigned family harmony in the house where I grew up. The air was thick with the smell of roasting turkey and my mother's apple pie, a scent that used to mean comfort but now felt like the cloying perfume of obligation. The house was filled with relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, all performing their designated roles in our annual family pageant. My father, as always, was the center of gravity, holding court in the living room with a glass of expensive scotch in hand, his booming laugh punctuating stories of his latest legal victory. My mother floated through the periphery, a ghost of a hostess, ensuring everyone's glass was full and the conversation never veered into uncomfortable territory. I moved through the crowded rooms feeling profoundly invisible. My uniform, which I had worn from the airport, had been met with a polite, "Oh, you didn't have time to change?" from my mother. I had explained that it was easier to travel in uniform, but the subtext of her comment was clear. It was out of place here, a stark, utilitarian reminder of a world that didn't belong in her perfectly decorated home. Cousins I hadn't seen in years asked me superficial questions. "So, are you still over there?" As if the entire world outside of Northern Virginia was one monolithic, dusty place. They'd listen to my one-sentence answer before their eyes would drift over my shoulder, looking for someone more interesting, more important to talk to. The contrast when they spoke to my siblings was stark. They peppered Anya with questions about a high-profile case she was working on, their voices hushed with reverence. They clapped Mark on the back, asking about his surgical fellowship, treating him like a visiting celebrity. I was a curiosity. They were the main event. We finally gathered in the formal dining room, the long mahogany table gleaming under the crystal chandelier. The seating arrangement was, as always, a map of the family hierarchy. My father at the head, with Anya and Mark flanking him. I was seated further down, between a great-aunt who was hard of hearing and a cousin who spent the entire meal scrolling through his phone. The placement was intentional, a subtle reinforcement of my status on the outer edge of the inner circle. The meal progressed predictably. The conversation orbited my father, his opinions on politics, finance, and the sorry state of the world dominating the discussion. He carved the turkey with theatrical flourish, a king dispensing bounty to his loyal subjects. As dessert was served, my father tapped his glass with a fork, the sharp clinking sound silencing the room instantly. It was time for the annual Thanksgiving toast, his moment to survey his domain and pronounce his satisfaction. He stood, glass raised, a benevolent patriarch surveying his legacy. "Every year," he began, his voice resonant with practiced authority, "I look around this table and I am filled with an immense sense of gratitude, for family, for health, and for the success we have all worked so hard to achieve. His eyes swept the room, landing on Anya. I am so proud of the people my children have become. Anya, your intellect and dedication to justice are a credit to this family. You carry the Rostova name with distinction and honor. Anya inclined her head, accepting the praise as her due. His gaze shifted to Mark. And Mark, your skill and compassion as a surgeon are already saving lives. You have a gift, and you are using it to make the world a better place. Your mother and I are in awe of what you've accomplished. Mark gave a modest, confident smile. Then my father's eyes swept past them, over the heads of my cousins and aunts, and landed on me. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by an Arctic chill. His face, which had been beaming with paternal pride, settled into a cold, hard mask. He paused, a deliberate, theatrical silence designed to draw every eye in the room to the subject of his disapproval. To me? Well, he said, his voice laced with a cool disappointment that was somehow more cutting than outright anger. Most of them. The words hung in the air, small and sharp and deadly. A collective, almost inaudible intake of breath rippled around the table. My great aunt, cupping her ear, whispered loudly to my cousin, "What did he say?" But everyone else had heard. Everyone understood. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a bit of playful ribbing. This was a public declaration. He continued, his gaze still locked on me, pinning me to my chair. But 2 out of 3 is a legacy any man would be proud of, to the family. He raised his glass, and after a beat of stunned, awkward silence, the rest of the table followed suit, their eyes darting between him and me. The clinking of glasses sounded unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense room. In that single moment, in front of our entire extended family, he had drawn a clear, undeniable line in the sand, and I was on the other side. He hadn't just ignored my accomplishments, he had negated my very worth as a member of his legacy. I wasn't just a disappointment, I was a statistical rounding error, a failure that only served to highlight the success of his other, more worthy children. The taste of my mother's apple pie turned to ash in my mouth. I didn't react, not outwardly. Years of military training, of learning to control my physical and emotional responses under fire, served me well in that moment. While my insides were a chaotic storm of shock, humiliation, and a white-hot rage that was startling in its intensity, my exterior remained perfectly still. I met my father's cold gaze for a beat, my expression unreadable, before deliberately picking up my fork and taking a bite of pie I could no longer taste. My lack of a dramatic response seemed to disconcert him more than tears or an angry outburst would have. He had expected me to crumble, to confirm his assessment of me as emotionally fragile and unworthy. My calm defiance was a language he didn't speak. He hesitated, then sat down, the momentum of his grand pronouncement dissipating into the awkward silence that now permeated the room. The spell was broken. The comfortable chatter of the family dinner did not resume. Instead, a strained, stilted series of separate conversations began, people speaking in hushed tones, carefully avoiding my section of the table. I watched my mother's hands tremble as she poured coffee. I saw Anya refuse to meet my eyes, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on her dessert plate. I saw Mark engage our uncle in an overly enthusiastic conversation about college football, his laughter a little too loud, a little too forced. They were all complicit in their silence, their refusal to challenge my father's cruelty, making them active participants in my humiliation. The hurt was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but on the surface, I remained a detached observer of my own execution. I watched my father accept congratulations from a business associate on his fine family, as if he hadn't just publicly disowned 1/3 of his children. I watched my cousins exchange knowing glances, their expressions a mixture of pity and a smug satisfaction that they were not the target of his disappointment today. And in that clinical detachment, I understood with a blinding, absolute clarity that my years of sacrifice meant nothing. Less than nothing. They were an inconvenience, a story that didn't fit the polished narrative of the Rostova family. The money I had sent home every month, the funds that paid for my mother's care, for my brother's car, for family vacations I never took, was not a token of my love and loyalty. In their eyes, it was an expected tribute, a tax I paid for the sin of being different. The missed holidays, the birthdays spent on a dusty base thousands of miles from home, the hollow ache of loneliness that was a constant companion on long deployments. I had borne it all with the belief that I was contributing to the well-being of my family, that my sacrifice had meaning. Now I saw it for what it was, a one-sided transaction. I had been fighting for the approval of a man who saw me as a blemish on his perfect family portrait, a flaw in his legacy that needed to be publicly cut out and discarded. My loyalty had been wasted. For years, I had operated under the delusion that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, gave enough, I could earn my place at the table. I had believed that love was something that could be won through performance. Now I saw the truth. My father's approval was not a prize to be earned. It was a birthright, and it had been bestowed upon my siblings from the moment they were born. Their paths, so aligned with his own values, confirmed his sense of self. My path, so foreign and independent, challenged it. He didn't resent me for failing. He resented me for succeeding on terms he didn't understand and couldn't control. A memory surfaced with painful clarity, a phone call from a few years ago. I was on a base in Germany, it was the middle of the night, and I had just led a successful operation that required months of planning. I was exhilarated, proud, and I had called home, wanting to share the news. My father had listened impatiently before cutting me off. "That's nice, Eva, but Anya just argued a case before the appellate court. We're all very proud." He hadn't been able to see my success because it didn't look like the success he recognized. It wasn't quantifiable in terms of courtroom victories or surgical saves. It was something other, and his worldview had no category for it. As the dinner party from hell finally began to break up, guests offered me awkward, pitying smiles on their way out. My mother approached, her eyes full of a familiar, helpless sorrow. "Your father, he gets like this sometimes," she whispered, as if his cruelty were a weather pattern beyond anyone's control. "He doesn't mean it." "Yes, he does," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. He meant every word. I didn't wait for her response. I gathered my things, offered a polite, generic goodbye to the room at large, and walked out of the house without looking back. The cold November air was a welcome shock after the suffocating atmosphere inside. As I walked to my rental car, the full weight of the betrayal settled on me, but something else was there too. A strange, liberating sense of peace. The fight was over. The long, exhausting, unwinnable war for my father's approval had finally come to an end. He had fired the last shot, and in doing so, he had set me free. My loyalty, my financial support, my desperate need for his validation, it was all a currency I no longer had to pay. The emotional umbilical cord had been severed not by my choice, but by his. And as I drove away from the house, I realized the hurt was already beginning to be replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I was done. Done with the performance, done with the sacrifice, done with fighting for a place in a family that had made it clear there was no place for me. My loyalty had been a gift they had taken for granted, and it was a gift I was about to rescind. Permanently. My decision was instant. It wasn't a product of long deliberation or a weighing of pros and cons. It was a chemical reaction, a profound and irreversible shift in my understanding of my place in the world. As I sat at that dining table, the echoes of my father's dismissal still hanging in the air, the years of quiet hope I'd harbored finally collapsed. The person I had been trying to be for my family, the dutiful daughter, the silent benefactor, the accommodating peacekeeper, was a role I could no longer play. The costume no longer fit. The trigger wasn't just his words, it was the chilling realization in their aftermath. It was the sight of my mother's practiced apology for his behavior, the way my siblings averted their eyes, the collective agreement of the room to pretend that this public cruelty was a normal family dynamic. I saw with perfect, terrifying clarity that nothing would ever change. I could become a general, I could walk on the moon, and my father would still find a way to frame it as a lesser achievement than my brother saving a single life in an operating room. His validation was a horizon I could chase forever but never reach. And I was done running. I didn't storm out, I didn't make a scene. My training had taught me the power of controlled action over emotional reaction. I excused myself from the table with a quiet, "If you'll excuse me, I need to make a call," and walked calmly to the foyer, my movements steady and deliberate. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but my hands were still. The house was quiet for a moment, the sounds of the dining room muffled by the closed doors. In the dim light of the hallway, I pulled out my phone. It's a protocol my team and I have for personal emergencies, a system we developed for situations where a verbal communication might be compromised or unwise. It's a simple, one-word text message that triggers an immediate, no-questions-asked extraction. We had used it in training exercises and on 2 harrowing occasions in the field. It was a lifeline, a declaration that the situation had become untenable and required immediate intervention. I had never imagined I would use it in my own parents' home. My thumb hovered over the screen. This was the point of no return. Sending this text would escalate the situation in a way that could never be undone. It would bring my two worlds, the one in which I was a disappointment and the one in which I was a respected officer, into a direct and explosive collision. For a fleeting second, the old habit of keeping the peace, of swallowing the hurt to avoid conflict, whispered in my ear. But the image of my father's cold, dismissive face silenced it. I typed the single word, "GO," and hit send. The message was delivered instantly, a small, quiet act that I knew would unleash a whirlwind. I put the phone back in my pocket and returned to the dining room, slipping back into my seat as if nothing had happened. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and waited. My father was now holding court again, pontificating on a recent political development, his earlier cruelty seemingly forgotten. The family had relaxed back into their familiar roles, the tension easing as they followed his lead, content to pretend the ugly moment had not occurred. They were adept at this, at smoothing over the cracks in their perfect facade. It took less than 3 minutes. At first, it was a faint, low hum, almost imperceptible beneath the drone of my father's voice. Then it grew, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards. The crystal glasses on the table began to tremble, a gentle, high-pitched ringing filling the air. My cousin looked up from his phone, a puzzled expression on his face. "What is that noise?" he asked. My father, annoyed at the interruption, paused his monologue. "It's probably just a commercial flight to Dulles," he said dismissively. But the sound grew louder, deeper, more powerful. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a jet engine. It was the percussive, ground-shaking beat of rotor blades. The windows began to rattle in their frames. A gust of wind whipped through the trees outside, sending a shower of autumn leaves against the glass. "That's no commercial flight," my Uncle James, a former pilot himself, said, his voice a mixture of confusion and alarm. My father stood up, his face a mask of irritation, and walked to the window. The sound was deafening now, a physical presence that consumed the room, making conversation impossible. Outside, powerful landing lights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the manicured lawn and illuminating the dining room in a brilliant, disorienting glare. "What in God's name is that?" my father shouted over the roar, his composure finally cracking. The other family members were on their feet now, crowding the windows, their faces a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Through the blinding lights, I could just make out the silhouette of a U-60 Black Hawk helicopter as it settled onto the lawn, its powerful downdraft flattening the prize-winning rose bushes my mother fussed over. The side door slid open, and two figures in full combat gear rappelled to the ground with practiced efficiency. They moved quickly, purposefully, toward the house. My aunt screamed. My mother looked like she was about to faint. My father stood frozen, his mouth agape, as the two uniformed figures reached the French doors of the dining room and, without hesitating, pushed them open and stepped inside. The roar of the helicopter lessened slightly, but the tension in the room skyrocketed. The two soldiers were imposing figures, their faces grim and professional, their presence a stark and terrifying intrusion into this world of suburban comfort. They scanned the room, their eyes missing nothing, before one of them spoke into his wrist communicator. "Ma'am, we are on site." The other family members stared, mouths open, their minds clearly struggling to process the scene. Then the front door of the house flew open, and a third figure strode into the foyer and then into the dining room. He was older, his uniform adorned with the insignia of a full colonel, his face a mask of calm authority. His presence immediately took command of the room. And he was walking directly toward me. The lead figure, my commanding officer, Colonel Miller, scanned the room with an expression of cool, professional assessment. His presence sucked all the air out of the space, his crisp, decorated uniform a stark contrast to the silks and cashmeres of my family's dinner party attire. The fear and confusion on my relatives' faces were palpable. They looked from the two armed soldiers standing guard at the doors to this imposing officer, their minds racing to find a narrative that could explain this impossible scene. A terrorist attack? A government raid? The concepts were so foreign to their world of catered events and country club politics that they couldn't begin to comprehend what was happening. Colonel Miller's gaze swept past my stunned father, dismissing him as one might an irrelevant piece of furniture. He walked directly to my chair at the far end of the table, his polished boots making no sound on the thick oriental rug. The room was so quiet now that I could hear the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound I hadn't noticed all evening. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. He stopped directly in front of me, his posture radiating a quiet authority that made my father's blustering seem like the antics of a spoiled child. He stood at attention, a formal, rigid posture of respect. And then, in the dead silence of the room, surrounded by my shocked and terrified family, he delivered a crisp, perfect salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, clear and unwavering. "We're ready when you are." The word, "ma'am," hung in the air, a grenade of incomprehensible information tossed into the middle of their carefully constructed world. It was a title of respect, of authority, of rank. It was a word that had no place in their narrative of me as the family failure, the potato-peeling disappointment. I watched the dawning horror on my father's face as his brain struggled to connect the daughter he just publicly disowned with the woman being saluted by a full colonel in his dining room. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The smug satisfaction he'd worn just moments ago had been replaced by a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. He looked at me, then at the colonel, then back at me, the cognitive dissonance visibly short-circuiting his understanding of the world. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was slowly being replaced by a dawning, shocking realization. Anya, the brilliant lawyer, looked utterly baffled, her sharp mind unable to process a situation so far outside the logical framework of her world. And Mark, the gifted surgeon, just stared, his face a blank canvas of confusion. For the first time in my life, I held all the power in that room. And I had done it without raising my voice, without arguing, without pleading for their respect. I had simply summoned my world into theirs, and the collision had shattered their reality. I slowly rose to my feet, my movements calm and measured. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, a simple act of composure that felt profoundly significant. I met Colonel Miller's gaze and gave a single, slight nod. "Thank you, Colonel, I'm ready." He dropped his salute and stepped aside, clearing a path for me. I turned to my family who were all staring at me as if I had grown a second head. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a final, dramatic confrontation. My actions had spoken more eloquently than any words ever could. I simply looked at my father, held his shocked, uncomprehending gaze for a long moment, and then turned my back on him. I walked the length of the dining room, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The two soldiers at the door stepped aside as I approached, their movements fluid and professional. Colonel Miller fell into step beside me as we walked through the foyer and out the front door, into the whirlwind of wind and noise from the waiting helicopter. The manicured lawn was illuminated in the stark, bright glare of the landing lights. The force of the downdraft whipped my hair across my face and pressed my dress against my legs. One of the soldiers from the helicopter ran forward to meet us, handing me a helmet and a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I put them on, the deafening roar of the rotors immediately softening to a manageable hum. As I was about to climb into the helicopter, I allowed myself one last look back at the house. My entire family was crowded in the doorway, and at the windows, their faces pale and stunned in the strobing lights. They were frozen, statues in a tableau of their own making, their comfortable, predictable world shattered beyond recognition. My father stood in the center of the doorway, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He had built his life on control, on understanding and manipulating the systems of power he recognized. But he was now confronted with a power he couldn't comprehend, a daughter who operated in a world with rules and ranks he had never bothered to learn. The soldier gave me a hand up into the cavernous interior of the Black Hawk. I strapped myself into a seat, and Colonel Miller sat opposite me, giving me a thumbs up. The door slid shut, and with a lurch that I barely felt, the ground fell away. Through the window, I watched my childhood home shrink below me, a perfect dollhouse filled with confused, broken dolls. The quiet whir of the helicopter blades was the only sound, a steady, powerful rhythm carrying me away from the life I was leaving behind and toward the one I had built for myself. The calls started 2 days later. For 48 hours, there was only silence from my family, a digital ceasefire that was more unnerving than an outright barrage. I had spent the time at a secure debriefing facility, not because of any real threat, but because Colonel Miller had insisted on a cooling-off period, as he put it. He understood, with a wisdom that transcended his rank, that the battle I had just fought was more personal and perhaps more damaging than many I had faced overseas. My phone, which I had kept on airplane mode, became an object of dread. I knew that turning it back on would be like opening a floodgate. When I finally did, the notifications poured in, a torrent of missed calls, voicemails, and text messages that painted a picture of a family in complete disarray. I started with the voicemails, listening to them with a strange, clinical detachment. The first was from my mother, her voice thick with tears. "Eva, please call me. We need to talk. I don't understand any of this. Your father, he hasn't left his study since you left. Please, darling." It was the same tone of helpless distress she had used my entire life, a plea for me to fix a situation she was unwilling to confront herself. Then came the call from my brother, Mark. His voice was awkward, confused, stripped of its usual easy confidence. "Eva, it's Mark. Look, I have no idea what happened the other night. A colonel? They called you ma'am? I don't get it. Call me back when you can. We're all really worried." His confusion was genuine, but underlying it was a note of indignation, the bewilderment of a golden child discovering that the family hierarchy was not what he had always believed it to be. The third voicemail was from Anya. It was brief and to the point, her lawyerly precision evident even in her emotional state. "Eva, this is Anya. I've run a background check on Colonel Miller. He's legitimate, which means your rank is legitimate. We need to have a family discussion immediately to address the legal and social ramifications of this situation." Ramifications? Not feelings, not apologies, just a cold assessment of the damage to the family's reputation. Finally, there was a clipped, formal voicemail from my father, his voice stripped of all its usual authority, leaving only a hollow, brittle shell. "Eva, we should talk." That was it. No apology, no explanation, no emotion. Just a summons, a last, desperate attempt to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond him. I deleted the voicemails one by one. I didn't call back. What was there to say? They still didn't understand. They were focused on the spectacle, the helicopter, the soldiers, the colonel, not on the years of quiet betrayal that had made such a spectacle necessary. They were worried about the ramifications, not the root cause. They wanted to talk, but they weren't ready to listen. Instead of calling, I sat down at my laptop and composed a single, brief email. I addressed it to all four of them, a clear message that from now on, I would be communicating with them as a single entity, not as individuals I could be manipulated by in separate conversations. The subject line was simple: going forward. The body of the email was equally direct. "Effective immediately," I wrote, "the monthly financial support I have been providing for the past 8 years will cease. The final transfer, which occurred last week, will be the last. Any future relationship between us will be contingent on a new set of terms. These terms are not negotiable. They will be based on a foundation of mutual respect, something that has been notably absent in our interactions to date. This respect includes acknowledging my career, my achievements, and my autonomy as an adult. Pity, condescension, and public dismissal will no longer be tolerated. Forgiveness is not on the table at this time. It is not something you can ask for, and it is not something I am prepared to give. If a genuine, healthy relationship is something you are interested in pursuing, it will have to be earned over time through consistent, demonstrated change in your behavior. The choice is yours. Eva. I read the email twice, checking for any trace of emotion, any hint of the hurt and anger that still simmered beneath the surface. I found none. It was as cold and precise as an after-action report. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of new terms of engagement. I hit send and felt a profound sense of release, as if a weight I had been carrying my entire life had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The response was almost immediate. A flurry of texts. "My mother, Eva, you can't be serious. We depend on that money. How could you be so cruel?" My father, "This is an unacceptable escalation. We will discuss this in person." Anya, "This action has significant financial and legal implications. Eva, you are acting rashly." Mark, "Eva, what about mom's medical care? This isn't fair." Fair. The word was a bitter irony. For years, they had benefited from a system that was fundamentally unfair to me, and now they were crying foul at the first taste of consequence. I did not reply to any of them. My email had said everything that needed to be said. The ball was in their court. Their next move would tell me everything I needed to know about whether our family had any future at all. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I was waiting for their proof of change. And I was fully prepared to wait a very long time. A year has passed. A year of quiet, seismic shifts. My life is full, defined not by the drama of my family, but by the respect and camaraderie of the people I serve with. Last month, I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, a milestone that I celebrated with my team, the family I had chosen, not the one I was born into. My work has become more demanding, more significant. I now lead a unit specializing in strategic intelligence, a role that requires not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of human dynamics, of predicting behavior based on patterns of past action. It's a skill, I've come to realize, that was honed not in a classroom, but in the complex emotional landscape of my childhood home. I no longer send money home. The absence of that monthly transfer, I've heard through the family grapevine, has had significant consequences. The European cruises have stopped. The casual redecorating of the house has ceased. My mother's medical care is still covered by their insurance, but the experimental treatments and luxury in-home assistance, the things my contributions quietly funded, are gone. My brother, Mark, had to sell his expensive car and take out a loan to cover his own rising expenses. Anya, for the first time, has had to contribute to our parents' household budget, a responsibility she has reportedly not shouldered with grace. My father no longer gives his grand, sweeping toasts at Thanksgiving. According to my cousin, last year's gathering was a quiet, strained affair. The patriarch, stripped of his absolute authority and financial certainty, is a diminished figure. He has been forced to confront a reality where his pronouncements no longer shape the world to his liking. I have not seen them. My email a year ago laid out my terms, and they have not yet been met. There have been overtures, of course. My mother calls every few weeks, her conversations a careful dance around the edges of apology, always stopping short of genuine accountability. She talks about how much she misses me, how the family isn't the same, but she has yet to say the simple words. We were wrong. We hurt you. We are sorry. My father has sent 2 formal, stilted emails suggesting a family meeting to resolve outstanding issues, as if our fractured relationship were a business negotiation to be settled. I have not replied. There is nothing to negotiate. My terms are clear. I hear snippets of their lives through my great-aunt, the one relative who has consistently reached out with no agenda other than to see how I am doing. She tells me they are struggling, not just financially, but with the collapse of their long-held identity. The Rostova legacy, once a source of immense pride, has been revealed as a fragile construct, built on a foundation of secrets and disrespect. The lesson in all of this wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It wasn't about revenge. I take no pleasure in their struggle. The lesson was for me. It was about realizing that I didn't need to be in the room for the toast at all. For 30 years, I had been fighting for a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. My father's love was a conditional prize I could never win because the rules were designed for me to fail. My worth was never his to give. It was only ever mine to own. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it comes with the quiet whir of helicopter blades fading into the night. It comes in the form of a rescinded financial transfer, a boundary firmly held, an email left unanswered. It's the slow, inexorable process of consequences settling into place. It's the peaceful realization that you are no longer responsible for managing the emotions of people who have refused to manage their own. Last month, I used some of my own savings to establish a scholarship fund for the children of enlisted service members, providing educational opportunities for families who understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. It's a small legacy, but it's mine. It's built on the values I believe in, not the ones I was expected to adopt. I don't know if my family will ever change, if they will ever be capable of the kind of introspection and humility that would be required to rebuild our relationship. But I've come to understand that their healing is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to myself, to the life I have built, and to the people who see me, respect me, and stand by me, not because of my name, but because of my character. The door to reconciliation is not locked, but it is no longer wide open. It can only be opened from their side, with the key of genuine, unconditional respect. Until then, I will continue to serve, to lead, and to live a life of purpose, a life that is authentically my own, finally free from the weight of their approval. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with your family to protect your own peace? The decision to demand respect can be one of the most difficult and most liberating moments in our lives. I'd love to hear your stories and your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about navigating complex relationships and finding your own strength. Thank you for listening, and remember that you have the right to define the terms of your own life, no matter who tries to write the script for you.